Knocked Speechless, a 2C-I trip report by King Basil Lammas, uploaded to earrid.org on November 1st, 2004. Knowing my friend was no stranger to psychedelics, I brought a few of the chocolate-covered mushrooms my roommate had recently acquired to the party. I had a beer while mingling and saying hello to everyone I know, and was soon toking off of his hookah, filled with a nice fruity tobacco and some weed. A little while later he suggested I come up to his room to meet a friend of his. Upon arriving there, I found a handful of people sitting around a guy with a pocket scale measuring some white powder onto a rolling paper out of a small blue bottle. After introductions were made, I inquired about the powder and tried to ascertain exactly what the hell this 2C-I stuff was. I know more than what I'd consider common knowledge about psychoactive chemicals, much from first-hand experience, but I hadn't heard of this particular one. Likening it to 2CB rang some bells, but I still had no first-hand experience to go on. I trusted my friend who was having the party enough to know he wouldn't lead me astray, so I gave my faith to the boy with the blue bottle, trading in my chocolates for a taste of this strange powder. He gave us each measured doses on a piece of rolling paper. I'm not exactly sure how much of a dose it was, but from extrapolations I've made afterwards I'm fairly sure it was only 10 milligrams. I swallowed the powder and washed it down and went back to mingling. He told us to report back to him to let him know if it was enough. After about an hour I was starting to feel a little something, like the very first tinglings of a body high, but it was very subdued. My friend has a high-speed internet connection, so I logged on and checked out what exactly it was I had imbibed. Normally I do my research beforehand, but there are some trusted sources who I will imbibe blindly from, this being one of them. Reports of it taking hours to take effect. Maybe I just haven't waited long enough. At this point I was still unclear as to how much I had taken, so I wasn't sure if it was a large or small dose. When I returned to the party, a friend of mine who had also taken of the powder was reporting that he wasn't feeling it and wanted to try more. I concurred, figuring even if it was just taking a long time to kick in, why not take some more and really blow our minds? I don't suggest this for everyone, but I don't mind having my mind blown once in a while on psychedelics. So we went back and took another measured dose. I think it's important to note here at this point that the scale being used went to 2 decimal places and read .7 with the 2C-I on it. Subsequent measuring of a piece of rolling paper by myself has determined it to weigh 60 milligrams, so that's why my guess was that it was 10 milligrams of 2C-I. But my measurements were made on a .002 +/-2 scale. I'm not sure about the accuracy of the scale in question, so it could technically vary by 5 to 10 milligrams. A big variation with such a potent chemical, to be sure. However much it was that we did, this sure did the trick. My friend who was throwing the party suggested we go for a walk, as the area he is in has a beautiful view looking out over a intentionally unnamed bay and cityscapes. He'd eaten the chocolates a little while before, and now we were all starting to come up into our respective highs. At this point I was feeling mostly a body high, a slight sense of euphoria, but my thoughts were also feeling a bit confused. There was a lot going on with people partying and music blaring, and there was a bit much to take in. A walk sounded wonderful. The view was expansive. I could feel the chemicals taking hold and the world starting to shift. I think being out there looking at the view in the quiet of the night had a profound effect on the rest of the experience that night. Another thing that quite affected it was the fact that I was under some tremendous pressure and project deadlines that had made me quite anxious the whole week. Normally this sounds like a wind-up for a bad trip, but luckily it just made it a weird one. As the group that went for the walk turned to go back, I fell a little behind. All of a sudden I felt detached from my companions. I worried they'd forgot about me and I would get lost wandering around in some strange psychedelic, not able to find my way back to the party. My friends turned a corner and were gone, and here I was, alone in the dark. When I turned the corner and saw them only some 20 paces ahead of me, I realised I was just letting anxiety get the better of me, and that I hadn't yet let myself go to the chemical that was very obviously taking over my brain. Once returning to the party, my memory gets a little spotty. I can tell you that I was definitely having a +3 experience by this point. I could not deny that chemicals were sloshing around in my brain. My body felt hot, and I found it hard to make any kind of effective communication with people. I felt like I'd fall in and out of contact, losing myself in my own little world. I was drinking lots of water since I was feeling so hot, and it was when I finally went to the bathroom that two strange things happened. One was that I found it hard to pee. Normally this is a pretty straightforward activity, but all of a sudden I found myself concentrating on making it work. I kept drinking lots of water, maybe out of habit or just not realising how much I was drinking, and I seemed to be in the bathroom a lot that night, and the problems with going persisted throughout most of the night as well. But being in the enclosed space with everything motionless except myself, I started to notice the hallucinations I was having. Patterns were rolling their way for a magazine cover on the floor. A cartoon ad on the wall of two people dancing found them bumping and grinding, shaking their hips at me in 3D. Colour patterns were dancing before my eyes as well. Quite fun really. But the effects it was having on my head made, and the fact that I felt like I was losing contact with my companions, having a hard time communicating with the outside world, unlike on something like ecstasy where it's sometimes hard to get me to stop communicating, I decided to find a quiet spot to sit. I made my way back up to my friend's room where no one was at the moment and sat for a spell, listening to some music. Too distracted to get the whole mix of MP3s I put on playing, I only put on one song, and it was then that I realised the time distortion. I sat for hours thinking and hallucinating when finally the song ended, and I realised that less than 10 minutes had actually passed. I made my way back to the party and my take on the whole thing had shifted. As I said, I was having a hard time communicating. It wasn't that I couldn't hear anybody or I couldn't think straight, well, maybe that, but I felt like I was just somewhere else from where everybody was. I sat in a corner and started watching and listening, started observing behaviour patterns. A few people would say one or two words and it would affect the movement of half a dozen people. Noise levels of voices would rise and fall, patterns emerging and collapsing again and again. As if the visual patterns weren't enough, but I was entranced by it all. Sooner or later it all became a little much for me. This must have been where I peaked. I have no other explanation for it. I crawled my way back to my friend's room for some comfort and safety. I felt like I didn't want to be around anybody. I had a longing to be in my room or somewhere similarly as comfortable where I could just ride the immensity of this out in a controllable climate. I put on some more music and lost myself in thought. My eyes were open and I was aware of my surroundings, but my consciousness lost any true sight of them. Instead, I was now just the voices in my head. It felt as though the single voice that claims to be I broke down into a cacophony. And then one voice broke through the noise and told me that it was always there, even when all the other voices had gone. Unlike the other voices speaking to me, this one seemed almost to come from somehow outside myself. Not that I heard the voice, but it didn't seem to be my own internal monologue like the others. It stopped my mind dead in its tracks. I'm not a religious person at all, but it felt like the voice of God had just entered my head, and I was filled with fright and awe. A definite +4 experience. Time stood still for a few minutes until I finally regained my senses. A profundity had just smacked me upside the head that I can only hint at in words. Soon others came into the room and broke my silent reverie. Went back down to the party and was mostly silent, still feeling rather trippy until the party was winding down, at least for those just drinking alcohol. I took up some space on a couch in hopes of coming down and getting some sleep, as I had to do a radio show the next day. Sleep was not forthcoming to say the least. I lay there on the couch and just listened to the sounds of people, again observing their behaviour. I was definitely still hallucinating, as a few more trips to the bathroom confirmed, but much of the body high had left. Other than the visuals I was experiencing, I felt like I was having a Comedown off of LSD, and expected to fall into an uncomfortable sleep any time now. Instead, I spent most of the night just laying there listening to people's voices. The view from before came back to haunt me in a synesthetic soundscape. When dawn finally came, and none of those who had taken the 2C-I had slept, I admitted to myself that sleep just wasn't happening. I got up feeling rather groggy, with a slight headache. I felt rather drained, but still not anywhere near sleep. I made my way into my show feeling kind of blunted around the edges. Still awake and aware, not like I'd normally feel after staying up all night, but definitely fatigued. By the time I got home, it was about 5 in the afternoon, and I curled up in bed and fell asleep. Woke up a few hours later feeling like nothing had really happened. Awake and alert, had some food, and then slept some more. Speaking of food, that was one of the weird parts of this trip. Staying up all night reminds me of other speedy things I've taken, but those always destroy my appetite. I wasn't particularly hungry during my trip as I'd eaten beforehand, but I did have some chips and whatnot at the party and didn't feel at all out of sorts as far as appetite. Others who had taken reported similar experiences as well. I did feel somewhat drained for a few days afterwards. Nothing quite like the depression of serotonin withdrawal from ecstasy, but a definite drowsiness. How much of that can be blamed on the drug, and how much on the simple fact that my sleep patterns got all messed up is hard to say. In conclusion, this is much different than ecstasy, although it did produce some mild euphoric feelings here and there. Much different than acid, although it did have similar hallucinations and body high, and also a Comedown. I think a couple variables combined to make this a pretty unique trip for me, and I don't quite expect the same results again, but it's definitely something I'd like to experiment with some more. If you're getting it in powder form, I'd also warn that the dosages are so damn tiny. I hadn't realised how little 20 milligrams really is until I measured it out for myself. I'd suggest getting your hands on an accurate scale to measure with, as this stuff is pretty potent.